When snow trapped a blind grandma, a neighbor boy dug a warm tunnel. Ephraim Cutter, who had buried 2 teamsters in 15 mountain winters, told him plainly, "The cold will take her first. Hunger will finish the rest." He had $11, a blind woman alone, and no way to hold a path. On January 9th, 1884, 10 feet of snow buried her door overnight. But 4 months earlier, Tobin Vale Mercer had never dug a tunnel in his life. He had arrived in Animas Forks the previous June, walking the last 4 miles from Silverton after his mother's coffin went into the ground. Lung fever had taken her in 11 days. The doctor cost $9. The burial cost $14. Tobin Vale Mercer had watched strangers lower his only family into Colorado dirt, counted his remaining coins, and started walking uphill toward the mining camps because someone told him they needed stable hands. The San Juan Mountains did not welcome boys. They tolerated them. At 11,000 feet, the air thinned and the winters killed without preference. Animas Forks sat in a high valley where summer lasted 3 months and the wind never fully stopped. By the time Tobin found work at Brackett's livery, sleeping in the hayloft for the cost of his labor, he understood one rule above all others. Nobody in this camp owed him anything. He was 14, undersized, quick with his hands, and invisible to most adults. The miners saw a boy who swept muck and carried feed. The shopkeepers saw a boy who split kindling for pennies. The women at the boarding house saw a boy who needed feeding but had no mother to ask for the scraps. Tobin saw himself more clearly than any of them did. He was a pair of hands attached to a hungry stomach, and both would stop working the moment he stopped being useful. His wages came to $11.08 by the first week of December. He kept the coins in a leather pouch tied inside his shirt, against his skin, because Silas Brackett had a habit of checking the loft for items that might belong to him. The old woman changed everything. Mrs. Elspeth Rourke lived 12 cabins uphill from the livery in a one-room shack that leaked wind through every seam. She was 68 years old, blind from fever since before Tobin was born, and alone in a way that made his own loneliness look like a crowded room. Her husband had died in a shaft collapse 7 years earlier. Her son had gone to California and stopped writing. She paid her rent with money from a church fund in Denver, and she survived each day by memorizing the exact number of steps between her bed, her stove, her woodpile, and her door. Tobin met her in August, when he delivered a sack of coal she had ordered from the general store. She could not see his face, but she heard something in his voice. "You are young," she said, "and you are alone." "Yes, ma'am." "So am I." She pressed 2 pennies into his palm. "Come back tomorrow. I need someone to read my receipts." He came back. He read her receipts, carried her water, stacked her kindling, and swept her floor. In return, she fed him biscuits that were always 1 day old and told him stories about the husband she had loved and the son who had forgotten her. She never asked about his mother. She seemed to understand that some wounds were too fresh for questions. By October, Tobin visited her cabin every 3rd day. By November, every 2nd day. The visits were not charity. They were survival. She needed hands that could see. He needed a voice that spoke to him like he mattered. When December came, he began to worry. The first snow fell on December 3rd. Tobin woke in the hayloft to find the world gone white, the air sharp enough to hurt his lungs, and the stable hands already arguing about which trails would close first. The old-timers said this winter smelled bad. They said the clouds sat too low, and the elk had moved too early. They said anyone with sense would be down in Silverton or Durango by Christmas, not stuck at 11,000 feet waiting to see how deep the drifts would stack. Tobin had no money for Silverton. He had $11.08, and he needed every coin for spring. On December 5th, he climbed to Mrs. Rourke's cabin and found her standing by the window she could not see through, her hands pressed flat against the frost. "The cold comes different this year," she said. "I can feel it in the glass." "You should go down valley, ma'am, before the road closes." "With what money?" She turned toward his voice, her clouded eyes finding nothing. "The church fund pays my rent. It does not pay for coaches." "I could ask around. Someone might." "No one will." Her voice held no bitterness, only fact. "An old blind woman is not freight worth hauling. I stay or I die trying to leave. Either way, the mountain decides." Tobin looked at her woodpile. 4 days of fuel, maybe 5 if she kept the stove low. Her coal bin held enough for another week. After that, she would burn whatever she could reach, her spare chair, her husband's old crate, the boards of her own floor if it came to that. "I will bring you wood," he said. "You have your own work." "I will bring you wood," he said again, and he meant it. But meaning it and doing it were not the same thing. Not in a San Juan winter, not at 11,000 feet, not when the snow began to fall and did not stop. By December 20th, the drift stood waist-high on level ground and chest-high against the cabin walls. Tobin dug a trench to Mrs. Rourke's door every morning, carried in an armload of split wood, and watched the trench fill behind him before he reached the livery. The wind did not simply blow. It carved. It relocated entire walls of snow overnight, turning yesterday's path into tomorrow's burial. He was losing. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Mrs. Rourke needed 2 armloads of dry wood each day to hold her stove steady. Tobin could carry 1 armload safely in weather, 2 if the path stayed clear. But the path never stayed clear. Every journey uphill cost him 40 minutes of digging. Every journey back cost him 30. By the time he finished his stable work, the light was gone, and Brackett had started watching him with the narrow eyes of a man counting someone else's time. On December 26th, Tobin climbed to her cabin and found the door drifted shut to the handle. He dug for an hour, his fingers going numb inside his gloves, his breath freezing on his collar. When he finally broke through, Mrs. Rourke was sitting by a cold stove, wrapped in every blanket she owned, her lips blue. "The fire went out," she said. "I could not find the wood. I am here now." He stacked kindling, struck a match, fed the flames until the iron began to tick with heat. "I will not let it go out again." "You cannot promise that." "I can try." "Trying is not enough." She reached toward his voice, her blind hand finding his wrist. "You are a boy. This is a mountain. The mountain does not care how hard you try." She was right, and they both knew it. Ephraim Cutter arrived on the afternoon of January 2nd, when the sky had turned the color of iron and the wind carried a new kind of cold, the kind that found seams in clothing and cracks in walls, and anywhere else it could reach living flesh. Cutter was 61 years old, built like a freight wagon, and known in Animus Forks as the man who decided when the pack train stopped moving. He had hauled ore over Red Mountain Pass for 15 winters. He had buried 2 teamsters after a slide near Mineral Point. He had lost 3 toes to frostbite and a wife to childbirth, and he carried both losses in the permanent scowl that had become his face. He found Tobin digging the trench to Mrs. Rourke's door and stood watching for a full minute before he spoke. "How deep?" 6 feet, Tobin said, not stopping. "Maybe 7 by the lee wall." "The widow still alive in there?" "Yes, sir." Cutter walked to the cabin's uphill side, where the drift had climbed past the window and merged with the roofline. He thumped the packed snow with his shovel handle, listening to the sound it made. Then he walked back to where Tobin was digging, looked down into the trench, and shook his head. "You do not have a path," Cutter said. "You have a grave with smoke leaking out." Tobin's shovel stopped. "She is alive. For now." Cutter pointed at the sky. "You see that color? That's another 3 feet coming tonight, maybe 4. The ridge wind will pack it hard by morning, and your little ditch will be a memory." He crouched at the trench's edge, close enough that Tobin could smell the tobacco on his breath. "I have seen this before. I have buried people who thought they could fight the mountain with shovels. You want to know what the mountain did to them?" "No, sir." "It buried them anyway." Cutter stood, brushing snow from his knees. "The old woman should have gone down valley in November. She did not. That was her choice. Now the choice is out of her hands and out of yours." He looked at Tobin with something that might have been pity. "If that old woman stays snowbound another week, the cold will take her first, and hunger will finish what the cold leaves." Tobin's hands tightened on his shovel. "Someone has to help her. Someone is not available." Cutter gestured at the buried upper lane, where roof lines poked above the drifts like headstones. Everyone in this camp is fighting for their own stovepipe right now. No one has spare hours to dig a tunnel to a blind woman who should not be here. Not the miners, not the shopkeepers, not me. He turned to leave, then stopped. If you want to do her a kindness, visit her tonight. Say goodbye. Then stay off this lane before the mountain takes you too. He walked away, his boots punching through the crust with each step, leaving Tobin alone in a trench that was already beginning to fill. That night, Tobin lay in the hayloft and listened to the wind. It did not howl. It moaned, a low, constant sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The temperature had dropped again. He could feel it in the way the hay crackled under his weight, the way his breath hung visible in the dark, the way the horses shifted and stamped in their stalls below. 9 feet of drift by the upper lane, another 3 or 4 coming tonight, the ridge wind packing it hard by morning. He did the mathematics in his head, the way he always did, looking for a number that would add up to survival, 2 armloads of wood per day, 40 minutes to dig each way, maybe 60 minutes if the drifts climbed higher. Brackett watching his time, his own meals shrinking because he could not earn while he dug. The numbers did not work. No matter how he arranged them, they ended the same way. A blind woman alone in a buried cabin, her fire gone cold, her hands reaching for wood that was not there. He thought about what Cutter had said. Say goodbye. He thought about what Mrs. Rourke had said. Trying is not enough. He thought about his mother in her coffin, and the sound the dirt had made falling on the lid, and the way the minister had said words about God's mercy while Tobin stood alone and understood for the first time that mercy was a thing people talked about, but the world did not deliver. Then he thought about something else. When Tobin was 10 years old, before his mother got sick, he had worked for a farmer outside of Denver who kept a hay barn with a north-facing wall. One December, a blizzard had collapsed a drift against that wall, burying a corner of the barn under 8 feet of snow. Tobin had been sent to dig out a calf that had wandered into the buried section before the snow sealed it in. He remembered crawling through the drift, shovel in hand, expecting to find the calf frozen. Instead, he found it standing in a pocket of still air, its breath steaming, its body warm to the touch. The snow had sealed the pocket. The calf's own heat had kept the space above freezing. The farmer had said something about it later, something about how snow held dead air, something about how the cold came from the wind, not the white. Tobin had not understood at the time. He had been 10. He had been tired. He had been thinking about supper. Now he understood. He lay in the hayloft, staring at the frozen rafters, and turned the memory over in his mind, the drift against the wall, the pocket of still air, the calf standing warm in a space the storm could not reach. Mrs. Rourke had told him something similar, months ago, when she was talking about the farm where she grew up. She had mentioned root cellars, the way farmers buried their stores underground and found them warmer in winter than the rooms above. She had mentioned her father saying the earth was a blanket, and the snow was a thicker blanket still, and only fools fought against what they could use instead. Tobin sat up in the dark. If he dug through the drift instead of across it, if the snow itself became the wall, if he made a tunnel instead of a trench, the wind could not fill a tunnel. The drifts could not collapse a tunnel, not if it was braced and arched and low to the ground, and inside that tunnel the air would be still. The cold would be bearable. The path would stay open no matter how much snow fell above. It was insane. He had never built anything larger than a feed trough. He did not know how deep the drifts would go, or how to keep a snow roof from collapsing, or how to get air into a passage buried under 10 feet of white. But he knew one thing: Cutter's way, the shovel, the trench, the daily battle against refilling snow. That way ended with Mrs. Rourke dead. If there was another way, he had to find it. In the morning, Tobin found a shallow drift behind the stable and started experimenting. He dug a small hole, then widened it, then tried to shape the roof into a curve. The first roof collapsed. The second held for 30 seconds before slumping. The third, braced with a scrap of willow branch from the kindling pile, stayed up. He crawled inside. The silence hit him first. The wind vanished. The constant moan of the storm, the sound that had been inside his ears for weeks, simply stopped. Inside the little pocket, the air was still and damp and cold, but not the killing cold of the open, not the wind cold that stripped heat from skin and lungs and bone. He stayed inside for 5 minutes, breathing, thinking, turning the problem over in his mind. The tunnel would need to be narrow, narrow enough that the roof could carry its own weight. It would need to be arched. He had seen that shapes that curved held better than shapes that lay flat. It would need bracing, willow hoops maybe, or broken slats from the crates behind the general store. And it would need to start from somewhere protected, somewhere with dry wood already stacked, somewhere Brackett would not notice him disappearing for hours at a time. The woodshed behind the livery, half buried, lee side, stuffed with cordwood that Brackett had not counted in weeks. If Tobin started there, if he cut a tunnel through the drift toward the upper lane, if he reached Mrs. Rourke's back wall, he could move wood from shelter to shelter without ever stepping into the wind. He could keep her stove fed without fighting the same trench every day. He could keep her alive. Maybe. If the tunnel held, if the snow did not crush him, if Brackett did not catch him stealing materials, if 100 other things went right that had no reason to go right at all. Tobin crawled out of his practice burrow, brushed the snow from his clothes, and walked back to the stable with his heart beating faster than it had in weeks. Mara Kells found him sorting willow branches behind the boarding house that afternoon. She was 23, red-haired, and sharp-tongued, the kind of woman who had learned to survive mining camps by seeing trouble before it arrived. She cooked 3 meals a day for 18 boarders, hauled water from the well when the men forgot, and kept a knife in her apron pocket that she had used exactly twice. "Those are Harmon's branches," she said, watching him bundle the willow into a coil. "He was saving them for basket weaving. I will bring him new ones." "With what? Your good intentions?" She crouched beside him, her breath fogging in the cold. "Brackett is already asking where his stable boy disappears to. You are digging that trench again, are you not? The one to the blind woman." "Not exactly." "Then what exactly?" Tobin hesitated. He did not know Mara well, only that she slipped him scraps sometimes and did not ask for payment. But telling someone meant inviting their doubt, and he had enough doubt already. "A tunnel," he said finally, "through the drift, not across it." Mara stared at him. "Through?" "The snow holds still air. It blocks the wind. If the roof is curved and braced, it should not collapse. If I start from the woodshed and dig toward her back wall, you will die." She said it flatly, without emotion. "Tunnels cave in, boys suffocate. You will reach halfway, and the roof will let go, and we will not find your body until spring." "Maybe. Maybe is not a plan. It is all I have." He tied off the bundle and stood. "The trench does not work. Every day I dig, the wind fills it back in. Every day I carry wood, she loses more than I can replace. If I keep doing what I am doing, she dies in 2 weeks, maybe less." Mara's expression did not change. "And if your tunnel collapses?" "Then I die." He met her eyes. "But if I do not try, she dies anyway. And I have to live with that. I do not want to live with that." For a long moment, Mara said nothing. She looked at the willow bundle in his hands, then at the sky, then back at his face. Something shifted behind her eyes, doubt giving way to something else. "Even if the snow does not kill you, the dark will," she said. "And if you do reach her, you will only bury yourself with her." "That is not— I am not finished." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a length of old curtain cord, frayed at the ends but still strong. "If you are going to dig a hole in the mountain, at least tie a line so someone can find your body." She pressed the cord into his hands and walked away before he could thank her. Silas Brackett was waiting for him when he returned to the livery. Brackett was 46 years old, thick through the chest, with hands like ham hocks and eyes that missed nothing of value. He owned the livery, the feed store, and a quiet share of 2 mining claims that had never produced enough to justify their purchase. He was not a cruel man in the way some mine bosses were cruel. He simply saw the world in terms of debts and payments, and he intended to collect every cent he was owed. He saw Tobin coming through the door and stepped into his path. Where were you? The boarding house. Harmon needed help with his stove. Harmon is 70 years old and has not touched his own stove since Nixon's wife started cooking for him. Brackett folded his arms. Try again. Tobin's mind raced. I was gathering kindling for my own use. With willow branches? Brackett's gaze dropped to the bundle, still visible under Tobin's coat. Willow does not burn hot enough to warm a rat. It bends, it braids, it builds. His eyes narrowed. What are you building, boy? Nothing. Nothing does not cost me daylight hours. Brackett reached out and grabbed Tobin's collar, pulling him close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath. I pay you to shovel muck and haul feed, not to disappear into snowdrifts, not to waste my materials, and not to dig holes for women who should have had the sense to leave before the passes closed. She's going to die. People die. Brackett's grip tightened. That is what happens when they make bad decisions. The old woman decided to stay. That was her choice. If she freezes, that is God's business, not mine and not yours. He released Tobin's collar with a shove that sent the boy stumbling backward. You work for me. Your time belongs to me. If I catch you wasting it on charity work again, I will dock your wages until spring and throw you out of that loft besides. Am I understood? Tobin's hands were shaking. He did not know if it was from cold or from something else. Yes, sir. Good. Brackett turned and walked toward the feed storage, then stopped. The good shovel. Where is it? By the back door. Not anymore. Brackett pulled a key from his pocket and tossed it in his palm. I'm locking the tools tonight. You can use the bent grain scoop and the coal spade. If you need anything else, you ask. He walked away, leaving Tobin standing in the dim stable with his bundle of willow and his length of cord and his plan that had just become twice as hard. That night, after Brackett had gone to his cabin and the stable had fallen silent, Tobin crept down from the loft with a grain sack over his shoulder. Inside the sack were the willow branches, the curtain cord, a stub of candle, 3 matches wrapped in oilcloth, and the bent grain scoop that Brackett had not bothered to lock away. The coal spade was already in the woodshed. He had hidden it there 2 days ago, when he first started thinking about the trench problem. He pushed through the snow to the shed's back wall, where the drift had climbed to the eaves and merged with the bigger drifts beyond. The temperature was somewhere below 0. He did not know how far, and it did not matter. What mattered was the wall of white in front of him and the blind woman buried somewhere on the other side. 32 yards. That was the distance from the woodshed to Mrs. Rourke's rear wall. He had paced it in autumn before the snow came, measuring the route with his feet because he had no other way to know. 32 yards through packed drift, maybe 9 or 10 feet deep in places, narrow enough that the roof would hold, arched enough that the weight would spread, braced with willow hoops where the snow ran soft. He had never built a tunnel before. He had never built anything before. But Mrs. Rourke was alive in the dark, 68 years old and blind and alone, and Tobin Vale Mercer was the only one who was coming for her. He picked up the coal spade and started to dig. The first foot was easy. The snow near the shed wall was loose, barely packed, falling away in chunks that he could scoop into the grain sack and drag out behind him. The second foot was harder. The drift compressed as it deepened, the crystals locking together into a dense white mass that required chopping rather than scooping. By the third foot, his arms were aching and his breath was coming in gasps that fogged the narrow space around him. He worked by candlelight, the flame guttering in the still air, casting shadows that jumped and danced on the walls of his tiny excavation. The silence was absolute. Outside the tunnel, he knew the wind was still blowing, still moaning, still piling snow on top of snow. In here, there was only the scrape of his shovel and the rasp of his breathing and the distant rhythmic thump of his own heart. He stopped at 6 feet to rest and to think. The roof had to be arched. He could see that now. The flat sections he had carved were already sagging, the packed snow wanting to slump under its own weight. He pulled out a willow branch, bent it into a hoop, and wedged it against the walls near the ceiling. The branch flexed, settled, and held. The sag stopped. He marked the spot with a knot in Mara's curtain cord and kept digging. By midnight, he had carved 9 feet of tunnel, a narrow passage barely 3 feet wide and 4 feet high at the center, forcing him to crawl on hands and knees when he moved forward. The floor sloped slightly backward toward the shed, so any meltwater would drain away from the working face. The walls were smooth where he had shaped them, rough where he had simply chopped. The air was still and cold and tasted faintly of earth, even though he was nowhere near earth. His hands were raw. His wrists had swollen. His fingers had split in 2 places, and blood had frozen into the fabric of his gloves. He backed out of the tunnel, covered the entrance with a board from the scrap pile, and climbed to the loft. He was asleep before his head touched the hay. The next morning, Brackett set him to mucking stalls, and Tobin worked without complaint. He fed the horses, hauled water, swept the aisles, and stacked the hay bales that had shifted overnight. He did everything Brackett asked and nothing Brackett did not ask, and by noon he had earned back 3 hours of the time he had lost the day before. In the afternoon, when Brackett rode down to Silverton to negotiate a hay contract, Tobin slipped back to the woodshed and crawled into his tunnel. 12 feet, 15, 18. He learned as he went. The roof held better when he shaped it like the inside of an eggshell. Smooth curves, no sharp edges, the weight flowing outward rather than pressing down. The walls stayed solid when he carved into the dense, wind-packed layers and avoided the lighter surface snow above. The floor needed to be flat but not smooth. Too smooth, and his knees slipped. Too rough, and his palms tore on the ice. At 21 feet, he hit a layer of ice, a frozen crust where the snow had melted and refrozen days ago. The crust was hard as stone. His coal spade bounced off it without leaving a mark. He tried the grain scoop, same result. He tried his knife, chipping at the ice in tiny flakes that accumulated like glass shards at his knees. It took him 3 hours to get through 4 inches of crust. By the time he broke through to the softer snow beneath, his candle had burned to a stub, and his shoulders felt like someone had been striking them with hammers. He backed out of the tunnel, shaking, and found Mara Kells waiting by the shed door. "You look like death," she said. "I feel worse." She held out a bottle wrapped in cloth. Steam rose from the neck. "Broth. Drink it before you fall over." Tobin took the bottle with hands that shook so badly he nearly dropped it. The broth was hot and salty and tasted like survival. He drank half of it before he could speak. "You do not believe I can do this," he said. "No." Mara's face was unreadable in the fading light. "But you are doing it anyway. That makes you either brave or stupid, and I have not decided which." "Both," he said. "Probably both." "Probably." She turned to leave, then stopped. "Harmon says he does not need those willow branches after all. He says his fingers are too stiff for basket weaving this winter anyway." She walked away before he could thank her. On the 5th night of digging, Tobin's candle went out and would not relight. He had been at the face of the tunnel, 27 feet from the shed door, when the flame guttered, flickered, and died. The darkness that followed was absolute, so complete that he could not tell whether his eyes were open or closed. He did not panic. There was no time for panic. He felt for the curtain cord tied along the left wall, found it with his fingertips, and began crawling backward. The cord told him he was moving in the right direction. The cord told him the shed door was behind him, not ahead. The cord told him that Mara Kells had given him exactly the gift he needed, even if neither of them had known it at the time. When he reached the entrance, he pushed aside the board and gulped the cold night air like a drowning man. He had learned something. The candle did not fail because it ran out of wax. It failed because the air at the far end of the tunnel had gone stale. 27 feet of sealed passage, with no way for fresh air to enter, had slowly filled with his own spent breath until the flame could no longer burn. He needed vents. Small holes punched upward through the snow, allowing bad air out and good air in. The next night, he brought a sapling rod and tested the idea. He found a spot where the packed snow felt solid overhead, angled the rod upward, and pushed. The rod broke through the surface 8 feet above. Cold air rushed down through the hole, and the candle flame steadied to a bright, unwavering point. He punched 3 more vents before morning. The tunnel breathed. At 29 feet, he stopped to rest and noticed something strange. The broth he had brought to drink had not frozen. In the open air, broth froze in minutes. In his coat pocket, it froze in an hour. Here, in the buried passage, it was still liquid. He held his hand in the still air and realized he had stopped shivering. The snow was holding the cold out. Silas Brackett found the entrance to the tunnel on the 7th night. Tobin had grown careless. He had left the covering board askew, and fresh snow had drifted into the shed in a pattern that pointed directly at the concealed opening. Brackett followed the tracks, pushed the board aside, and stood staring into the dark passage with an expression that Tobin could not read. "Well," Brackett said, "the mole boy has been busy." Tobin said nothing. There was nothing to say. Brackett crouched at the tunnel mouth, peering into the darkness beyond. "How far?" 30 feet, maybe 31. "And you built this with what? A bent grain scoop and a coal spade?" "Yes, sir." Brackett was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, brushed snow from his knees, and turned to face Tobin with eyes that had gone flat and hard. "You used my wood. You used my shed. You used my time, my tools, and my materials. And you did it to dig a hole to a woman who will be dead by February, no matter what you do. She is not. She is 68 years old and blind." Brackett's voice was cold. "She cannot feed herself. She cannot warm herself. She cannot find her own door without bumping into walls. Even if you finish your little tunnel, even if you keep her stove lit through January, what then? February will be worse. March will bury everything you have built, and you will have spent the whole winter digging graves instead of earning wages." Tobin's hands were shaking again. "I am not digging a grave?" "No?" Brackett gestured at the tunnel. "Then what is this? A road? A road to where? A road for what?" He stepped closer, close enough that Tobin could smell the sweat and tobacco on his coat. "The old woman is dead. She was dead the moment she refused to leave in November. You're just too young and too stupid to see it. She is alive. Not for long." Brackett reached out and grabbed the covering board, slamming it back into place over the tunnel mouth. "This ends now. You will not dig. You will not visit her. You will work your hours, earn your wages, and let the mountain do what mountains do." He turned to leave, then stopped. "I am docking you 2 days' pay for the materials you stole, and if I catch you at this again, I will throw you out of the loft and find a boy who understands what work means." He walked away into the dark. Tobin stood alone in the shed, staring at the board that covered everything he had built. He did not go to the loft that night. He sat in the corner of the shed, his back against the wall, and waited for his heart to stop pounding. The cold crept in through his coat, through his boots, through the thin places in his gloves where his own blood had stiffened the fabric. Brackett was right. He knew that. The mathematics had not changed. Mrs. Rourke was 68 and blind and alone, and the winter would keep coming no matter how many feet of tunnel he carved through the white. February would be worse than January. March would bury everything. The mountain did not care how hard he tried, but he thought about her voice coming through the buried wall, the way she said his name when he arrived, the way her hands found his face in the dark and traced the shape of his cheekbones as if memorizing a map she could not see. He thought about the broth in his pocket, still liquid in the buried air, the candle flame burning steady after he punched the vents, the silence inside the tunnel, the absolute absence of wind, the warmth that came from stillness alone. The mountain did not care, but maybe he did not need it to. After an hour, he pushed the board aside and crawled back into the tunnel. 30 feet of passage stretched behind him, narrow and curved and braced with willow hoops that he had cut with stolen branches and tied with cord from a woman who called him stupid. He picked up the coal spade and kept digging. He was not finished yet. The man who found Tobin stealing stovepipe wire was not the man Tobin expected. He had crept behind the general store on the 8th night, looking for scraps that no one would miss. The store's back lot was a graveyard of broken equipment, cracked barrels, bent hoops, rusted fittings, and coils of wire left over from repairs that never happened. Tobin needed the wire to reinforce the tunnel's weakest sections, where the packed snow ran thin and the willow hoops alone could not hold the weight. He was untangling a length of copper from a ruined stove collar when the voice came from the darkness. That belongs to someone. Tobin froze. His hand tightened on the wire. I was not. You were. The voice was calm, accented, patient in a way that did not match the words. You were taking it because you need it. The question is what you need it for. A figure stepped out of the shadow of the store's back wall. He was perhaps 58 years old, thin but not frail, with a gray beard trimmed close to his jaw and eyes that caught the moonlight like polished stones. He wore a heavy coat patched in 3 places and boots that had seen better winters. His hands, Tobin noticed, were the hands of someone who worked with metal, scarred, calloused, permanently stained with dark residue around the nails. I know you, the man said. The stable boy, Brackett's mule. I am not his mule. No? The man tilted his head. Then what are you? Tobin did not answer. He was calculating distances, how far to the alley, how fast he could run, whether the man would bother chasing a boy over a few feet of wire. My name is Yehuda Blum, the man said. I repair stoves and tin work. I have been watching the tracks in the snow behind Brackett's shed for 3 nights now. They lead somewhere, and they do not lead to the stable. He gestured at the wire in Tobin's hand. You are building something. I want to know what. Why? Because I'm curious. Blum stepped closer, and Tobin saw that he was not angry. He was interested. Curious men live longer than bored men. Curious men see things that others miss. And I have seen you, Tobin Mercer. I have seen you crawling through that snow like a badger, dragging sacks of white behind you, emerging at midnight covered in frost and bleeding from your hands. He stopped an arm's length away. A boy does not do that for nothing. A boy does that because he is trying to keep something alive. Tobin's grip on the wire loosened. The widow, he said. Mrs. Rourke, on the upper lane. The blind woman. She is buried. The drifts closed her door. Cutter says she will die by February. Brackett says I'm wasting time. Everyone says there is nothing to be done. And what do you say? Tobin met the man's eyes. I say I'm digging a tunnel through the drift, from Brackett's woodshed to her back wall. If the roof holds and the air stays good, I can move wood from shelter to shelter without fighting the surface. I can keep her stove lit. Blum was quiet for a long moment. His gaze moved over Tobin's face, taking in the exhaustion, the cracked lips, the determination that had not yet cracked. Show me, he said. They crawled through the tunnel together by candlelight. Blum went first, his thin frame fitting the narrow passage more easily than Tobin had expected. At each section, he paused to examine the walls, the roof, the willow bracing that Tobin had lashed into place with cord and desperation. At the working face, 31 feet from the shed, Blum ran his fingers along the curved ceiling. He pressed his palm flat against the packed snow. He looked at the vent holes Tobin had punched upward, the drainage slope Tobin had carved into the floor, the reinforced sections where the roof wanted to sag. Who taught you this? He asked. No one. You are lying. I am not. Tobin's voice came out sharper than he intended. I watched a calf survive in a collapsed drift when I was 10. I remembered what Mrs. Rourke said about root cellars. I figured the rest. Blum turned to look at him, and something in his expression changed. You made the roof curve on your own? Flat roofs fall, curved roofs hold. I could see it. You punched the vents because the air went bad. The candle died. I almost could not find my way out. I needed the air to move. And the drainage slope? Meltwater pools. If it freezes, the floor becomes ice. Ice makes you slip. Slipping makes you slow. Being slow gets you killed. Bloom sat back on his heels, his head bent to avoid the low ceiling. For a long moment, he said nothing. The candle flame flickered between them, casting shadows that danced on the walls of Tobin's impossible passage. In the old country, Bloom said finally, I had a brother, younger than me. Quick with his hands, like you. We grew up in the mountains, different mountains, but mountains all the same. One winter, the snow came early and buried the road to our village. My brother tried to dig a trench to the neighbor's house where they kept the milk cow. The trench collapsed. Tobin's throat tightened. Did he survive? Bloom's voice was flat. Yes, I pulled him out. He lost 2 fingers to the frostbite, and he never walked quite right after that, but he lived. He looked at the tunnel walls. He was digging the wrong way. Flat trench, straight walls, no bracing. The snow did what snow does. It let go. I am not digging flat. No, you are not. Bloom reached out and touched one of the willow hoops, pressing it gently. You are digging like someone who understands what snow wants to do. You are fighting the right enemy. He turned to face Tobin directly. But you are fighting it with the wrong tools. They crawled back to the shed, and Bloom spread the wire on the floor. He bent it, tested it, bent it again. This is copper, he said. Soft. Good for binding, not good for structure. What you need is iron wire, thicker, stiffer, something that will hold a hoop under load. He looked at the willow branches stacked in the corner. The willow is good, flexible. It bends with the weight instead of breaking, but you have been tying the hoops wrong. Wrong how? Bloom picked up 2 branches and lashed them together with a quick motion. You tie them at the crossing point, yes? Where the ends meet. Yes. That is the weak point. The knot slides under pressure. The hoop opens. The roof comes down. He retied the junction, this time wrapping the cord in a different pattern, 3 loops around, then a twist, then 3 loops the other direction. This way, the knot locks. The more pressure, the tighter it holds. A man showed me this in the old country. A man who built timber arches for bridges. He said a structure keeps standing because somebody remembers where it wants to fail. Tobin watched the pattern of the knot, memorizing each turn. Where does a snow tunnel want to fail? Everywhere. Bloom's voice held no humor, but mostly at the changes. Where hard snow meets soft snow, where your angle shifts, where the drift was packed by wind and suddenly becomes loose again. Those are the danger points. Those are where you brace. He stood, brushing snow from his coat, and looked toward the tunnel entrance. I will help you, he said. Not because I believe you will succeed, I do not know if you will succeed, but because you are trying to do something that makes sense. The curved roof, the vents, the drainage slope. These are not the ideas of a foolish boy. These are the ideas of someone who is paying attention. He met Tobin's eyes. I am 58 years old. I have no wife, no children, no one waiting for me anywhere. I have my tools and my skills and my curiosity. If I die in a snow tunnel trying to save a blind woman I have never met, that is not the worst way for a man to end. Tobin did not know what to say. He had expected resistance, more voices telling him he was wasting time, more predictions of failure, more reminders that the mountain did not care. He had not expected someone to crouch beside him in the dark and say, I will help. Why? He asked. Bloom smiled, and the smile was sad and knowing and old. Because I have been the boy in the snow before, and someone helped me then. This is how the debt is paid. They dug together the next 5 nights. Bloom could not crawl as fast as Tobin, but he did not need to. His value was in his mind, the way he read the snow, predicted the weak points, taught Tobin to feel for the places where the pack changed density. He brought iron wire from his own supplies, scavenged from broken stove fittings he had not yet repaired. He brought a hand auger for punching cleaner vents. He brought a small lamp that burned steadier than candles and produced less smoke. He taught through action, not lecture. When Tobin made a mistake, cutting too shallow, bracing at the wrong angle, leaving a weak point unaddressed, Bloom did not explain what had gone wrong. He simply corrected it, hands moving with the certainty of long practice, and Tobin watched and learned. "Feel here," Blum said on the third night, pressing Tobin's palm against a section of ceiling. "What do you notice?" Tobin closed his eyes. The snow under his hand was colder than the sections around it. "It is denser, harder. Wine crust. The wind packed it tight, then the next layer settled on top. The crust will hold weight, but only from above. Push from below, and it will shear." Bloom tapped the section with his knuckle. "Never cut through crust without bracing first. The layer above it thinks the crust is the floor. Remove the floor, and the whole weight comes down." "How do you know this?" "Experience." Bloom's voice was quiet. "I have seen a mine shaft collapse. I have seen what happens when the thing holding everything up suddenly disappears. You learn to feel for it after that. You learn to not trust the things that seem strongest." At 35 feet, Tobin punched a vent and hit something unexpected, a pocket of air that was warmer than the surrounding snow. The warmth rose through the vent hole in a soft, invisible current, fogging in the cold air above. "What is that?" he asked. Bloom crawled forward to examine the hole. He held his hand over the opening, feeling the rising air, then lowered his face to sniff. "Smoke," he said. "Wood smoke, very faint. A stove." "Her stove?" Bloom looked back at Tobin, and his eyes held something that might have been wonder. "You're close. The warmth is leaking up through the drift from her cabin. You are almost there." Tobin's heart lurched. 35 feet. He had estimated 32 to her back wall. He had overshot, or the drift had compressed, or she had somehow moved her stove closer to the rear of her cabin since autumn. But the warmth was there. The smell of wood smoke was there. She was alive and burning her fuel and waiting for someone to reach her. "Tomorrow," Tobin said. "I finish tomorrow." "Tonight," Bloom corrected. "If you can smell her smoke, she is down to her last wood. Tomorrow may be too late." They worked through the night. Tobin carved while Bloom braced, the two of them moving in a rhythm they had learned over 5 nights of shared labor. The air grew warmer as they advanced, the smell of smoke stronger, until Tobin could taste it on his tongue, the bitter edge of burning pine, the ghost of a fire that was keeping one old woman alive. At 40 feet, Tobin's spade struck something that was not snow, a wall, frozen planks, the back of a cabin that had been buried for weeks. He stopped digging. "There," he said, his voice cracking on the word. "She is in there." Bloom pressed his ear to the wood. For a long moment, he was silent. Then he closed his eyes and smiled. "I hear her," he said. "She is singing. Some old hymn. She does not know we are here." Tobin thought about pounding on the wall, about shouting her name, about breaking through this moment and announcing that salvation had arrived. But Bloom stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Not here," he said. "This is the back wall. If you break through here, you flood her cabin with cold air and kill her fire. We need to find the door or a window, something that opens and come through where she can close it behind us." "How?" "We dig sideways. Follow the wall. Find the corner. Go around to where the door would be or to the back window if there is one. Then we cut through." More digging. More hours. Tobin's arms felt like water. His hands were bleeding again, the old splits reopened by the constant grip of the spade. But they turned the corner, followed the wall, and found the back window, a small square frame shuttered from inside, frozen solid into the drift that had swallowed it. Tobin cut around the frame. He widened the chamber, creating a space large enough to stand in a crouch. He pressed his face to the crack where the shutters met and called her name. "Mrs. Rourke, it is Tobin. Can you hear me?" Silence. Then a shuffling sound. Then a voice, thin, cracked, but alive. "Tobin?" She sounded like she was dreaming. "Tobin, where are you?" "At your back window. I dug a tunnel through the snow. I'm going to open the shutter. Can you unlatch it from inside?" "I cannot see. I do not know where." "Follow my voice." Tobin spoke slowly, clearly, the way he always did when guiding her blind hands. The back wall, the window, 3 steps from your bed. Feel for the latch. It is a hook on the right side. He heard her moving. He heard her hands sliding across wood, searching, finding nothing, searching again. Then the scrape of metal, the click of a latch releasing, and the shutter swung inward. Cold air rushed through, and in the gap, backlit by the dying glow of her stove, Tobin saw her face. She was thinner than he remembered. Her skin had gone pale, almost gray. Her lips were cracked and her hair was matted and her blind eyes stared at nothing, the way they always did. But she was alive. "There you are," she said, reaching toward him with one trembling hand. "I knew you would come." The first thing he did was bring her soup. Bloom had a pot of broth heating in his rented room, left over from his own supper. Tobin crawled back through the tunnel, collected the pot, and brought it to Mrs. Rourke's cabin through the new passage. She drank it slowly, her hands shaking, spilling more than she swallowed at first. But the warmth seemed to wake something in her, and by the time the pot was empty, she was sitting upright and asking questions. "How?" she said. "The drift is 10 feet deep. I heard them say so before the sound stopped coming through the walls." "Deeper than that now," Tobin said. "But a tunnel does not care how deep the snow is, only how far you have to go." "You dug through?" "Yes, ma'am." "Alone?" Bloom's voice came from the window, where he was examining the shutter's hinges. "Not entirely alone, but the boy did most of the work. I only showed him a few tricks." Mrs. Rourke turned toward the new voice, her blind eyes searching. "Who are you?" "Yehuda Bloom, a tinsmith, a meddler, an old man who should know better than to crawl through snow on his hands and knees." He moved to crouch beside her, and she reached out to touch his face the way she had once touched Tobin's, fingers tracing cheekbones, jaw, the texture of his beard. "Your boy has built something remarkable, Mrs. Rourke, a road under the storm. If it holds, you will not need to wait for rescue. The rescue is already here." The tunnel held. Tobin tested it every day for the next week, crawling through with armloads of split wood, pots of soup, candles, matches, and anything else Mrs. Rourke needed. The passage stayed solid. The vents kept the air fresh. The willow hoops flexed under the weight of new snow, but did not break. Inside the tunnel, the temperature stayed well above the killing cold outside. Tobin had no thermometer. He could not have read one anyway, but he could feel the difference in his skin. The surface air cut like a blade. The tunnel air was still, damp, almost gentle. The broth he carried did not freeze. His gloves dried overnight when he left them in the widened pocket near the shed door. The snow did not insulate against cold exactly. It insulated against wind, and wind was what killed. Mrs. Rourke's stove stayed lit. Her cabin stayed warm. She ate better than she had eaten in weeks because Tobin could bring her food without losing an hour to trench digging each way. And slowly, impossibly, she began to recover. Her color came back. Her voice strengthened. She stopped singing hymns to herself in the dark and started asking Tobin about his day, the way she had in autumn. She could not see the tunnel, could never see it, but she could feel it. She could feel the still air coming through the window whenever he opened the shutter. She could feel the warmth of the wood he carried. "The mountain tried to bury me," she said one night as Tobin was stacking kindling by her stove. "And you turned the burial into a road." Tobin did not answer. He did not know what to say. But he thought about the calf in the collapsed drift. He thought about the root cellars Mrs. Rourke had described. He thought about Yehuda Bloom pressing his palm against a wind crust and explaining where structures wanted to fail. A road under the storm, a warm tunnel, a passage that the wind could not find and the drifts could not fill. He had built it with a bent grain scoop and stolen wire and the stubborn refusal to let an old woman die alone, and it was working. Ephraim Cutter came back on the 12th of January. The storm had paused, not ended, just paused, the way San Juan storms sometimes did when they were gathering strength for a second assault. The sky was iron gray. The wind had dropped to a steady moan, and Cutter came walking up the buried lane with 2 men behind him, checking the upper cabins, counting the living and the dead. He found Tobin emerging from the tunnel mouth behind Brackett's shed. "Still digging," Cutter said. It was not a question. "Still digging." Tobin brushed snow from his coat. "She's alive. I've been feeding her stove for 6 days." Cutter's face did not change. He looked at the tunnel entrance, the covered board, the compressed snow around the frame, the faint fog of warm air leaking from beneath, and then he looked back at Tobin. "Show me." They crawled through together. Cutter went first, his thick body filling the passage more tightly than Bloom's thin frame had. He stopped at each vent hole, each bracing hoop, each section where the roof curved into smooth, packed arch. He ran his hands along the walls the way Bloom had, feeling for the density changes, the weak points, the places where the structure might fail. At the chamber by Mrs. Rourke's window, he stopped and looked back at Tobin. His face was unreadable. "The widow," he said. "She's in there?" "Yes, sir." "Alive?" "Yes, sir." Cutter pulled himself up to the window and called through the gap. "Mrs. Rourke, this is Ephraim Cutter. Can you hear me?" Her voice came back, stronger than it had been a week ago. "I hear you. What do you want?" "I came to see if you were dead." "I am not dead." There was a note of defiance in her voice, a sharpness that Tobin had not heard since autumn. "The boy has been keeping me alive. He built a road under the snow. Can you imagine that? A road under the snow, and he is only 14. Cutter was silent for a long moment. Then he backed away from the window, turned to face Tobin in the cramped chamber, and something in his expression shifted. "I told you she would die," he said. "I told you the cold would take her first, and hunger would finish what the cold left." "Yes, sir. I was wrong." Cutter's voice held no emotion, not shame, not admiration, just a flat acknowledgement of fact. "You dug a road the storm itself could not shut. I have spent 15 winters in these mountains, and I have never seen anyone do what you did." He did not say more. He did not need to. He crawled back through the tunnel, emerged into the gray morning light, and walked away without looking back. Tobin sat alone in the chamber by Mrs. Rourke's window, listening to the silence of the buried snow, and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. It was not pride exactly. It was not relief. It was the feeling of being seen. The storm came back on January 14th. This time it did not pause. For 23 days the sky dropped snow. Not flurries, not squalls. A continuous fall of white that buried eaves and erased lanes, and turned the entire camp of Animus Forks into a collection of mounds with stovepipes leaking smoke. Drifts climbed past windows. Roofs groaned under loads they were never designed to carry. The temperature dropped to 47 below zero on the worst night, cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground, cold enough to kill a man who stayed outside for more than minutes. Tobin watched the numbers in his head. Mrs. Rourke needed 2 armloads of dry wood per day. The woodshed held enough for maybe 40 days if he rationed carefully. The tunnel was 41 feet long. The snow above it was now 12 feet deep in places, packing tighter with each new fall. The math still worked, but the margins were shrinking. On January 19th, a section of the tunnel sagged. Tobin discovered it at midnight, crawling through with a load of split wood for Mrs. Rourke's morning fire. He was halfway along the passage when his lantern caught something wrong, a bulge in the ceiling, a place where the smooth arch had deformed into a hanging weight of compressed white. The willow hoop beneath it had bent nearly flat. The iron wire Bloom had added was stretched to the breaking point. He backed out slowly, carefully, feeling the ceiling with his free hand as he moved. The bulge did not collapse, but it would. Soon. He found Bloom in his rented room, asleep on a narrow cot, his breath fogging in the cold. "The tunnel is failing," Tobin said. "Section 19. The roof wants to let go." Bloom was awake in an instant, pulling on his coat, gathering tools. "Show me." They crawled to the damaged section together. Bloom examined the bulge with his fingers, pressing gently, reading the snow the way a doctor reads a pulse. New load, he said. The drift shifted above us, maybe a roof slide from one of the neighboring sheds. The weight transferred here. He looked at Tobin in the lamplight. We can brace it, but if we do it wrong, we bring the whole section down. What do we do? Bloom thought for a moment. We need a plank, something rigid. We jack the ceiling from below while we tie new hoops above. The plank holds the weight while we work. Then we remove the plank and let the new hoops carry the load. I do not have a plank. Then we find one. They found one behind the general store, a board from a broken packing crate, 3 feet long and half an inch thick. It was not ideal. It was what they had. Tobin carried it into the tunnel while Bloom brought willow hoops and iron wire. At section 19, they positioned themselves beneath the bulge and prepared to work. I will lift, Bloom said. You brace. When the ceiling is high enough, tie the new hoops as fast as you can. What if it collapses? Then we are buried. Bloom's voice was calm. Try not to let it collapse. He positioned the plank against the sagging ceiling and began to push. The snow groaned. The existing hoop bent further, then caught against something solid. The bulge rose, half an inch, 2 inches, and held. Tobin moved fast. He lashed the first new hoop into place, using Bloom's knot pattern, pulling the cord tight until his fingers ached. He tied the second hoop above the first, then the third, spacing them closer together than any section of the tunnel so far. Done, he gasped. Bloom released the plank. The ceiling held. They sat in the narrow passage, breathing hard, staring at the reinforced section by the light of the guttering lamp. You learn quickly, Bloom said. I have a good teacher. Bloom smiled, but the smile was tired. I cannot do this much longer. My hands are not what they were. My lungs are not what they were. This winter is taking pieces of me I will not get back. Then rest, I can. You can do what needs to be done. Bloom reached out and gripped Tobin's shoulder. That is what I am saying. A structure keeps standing because somebody remembers where it wants to fail. You remember now. You can read the snow. You can feel the weak points. You do not need me holding your hand anymore. Tobin did not know how to answer. He had never thought of Bloom as someone holding his hand. He had thought of him as a partner, someone who shared the work, shared the risk, shared the knowledge that kept them both alive. But partners did not stay forever. He knew that. His mother had not stayed. His father, whoever his father had been, had not stayed. The people who helped you eventually went somewhere else, and you had to keep standing without them. Teach me everything you know, Tobin said. Before you go, teach me everything. Everything? Bloom laughed softly. That would take years. Then teach me enough. Enough for what? Enough to keep the tunnel open. Enough to save her. Enough to not be the boy who let the roof fall. Bloom was silent for a long moment. The lamp flickered between them. All right, he said finally. Everything I can. As long as I can. On the night of January 23rd, everything came apart at once. It began with a sound, a deep muffled thump that Tobin felt more than heard, coming from somewhere above and to the east. A roof collapse. Maybe the old storage shed behind the blacksmith, or maybe one of the abandoned claim shacks on the upper ridge, somewhere close enough that the weight transferred through the drift. Tobin was in the tunnel when it happened, halfway between the shed and Mrs. Rourke's cabin, carrying a pot of soup that Mara had left by the stable door. The ceiling bucked. He dropped flat, soup spilling across the floor, his arms covering his head. Snow cascaded from above, not a collapse, not yet, but a warning. Loose granules sifting through cracks that had not been there a moment ago. He lay still, listening. The guide cord along the wall was slack where it should have been taut. Somewhere ahead something had shifted. Somewhere behind something had shifted. The tunnel was moving, not falling, but settling, adjusting to a new distribution of weight that had arrived without warning. He counted his breaths. 1, 2, 3. The sifting stopped. The ceiling held. He crawled forward, leaving the spilled soup behind, following the guide cord toward Mrs. Rourke's cabin. At section 28, he found the damage. A new bulge, bigger than the first. The ceiling had dropped 6 inches in a span of 3 feet, crushing one of his willow hoops flat and pushing another to the breaking point. Snow was still sifting through a crack in the center, a slow, steady fall that was filling the passage with loose powder. He could not pass. The gap was too narrow, and on the other side of that gap, Mrs. Rourke was waiting for soup that would never arrive. Tobin backed out of the tunnel and found Bloom in the stable, where he had been resting by the stove. "New collapse," Tobin said. "Section 28. I cannot get through." Bloom's face went pale. "The widow. She has wood for tonight. Maybe tomorrow morning. After that, her stove goes cold." They gathered tools and crawled into the tunnel together. At section 28, Bloom examined the damage by lamplight, his fingers reading the snow the way a surgeon reads an injury. "Worse than the first," he said. "The weight is coming from 2 directions. If we jack it wrong, we compress the load sideways. The whole section becomes unstable." "Can we dig around it?" "No. The drift is too dense on both sides. We go through, or we do not go at all." Tobin thought about Mrs. Rourke alone in her cabin, feeding her stove the last of her wood, not knowing that the road beneath the snow had closed behind her. He thought about her voice coming through the back window, thin and cracked and alive. "I knew you would come." "Then we go through," he said. "Show me what to do." They worked for 3 hours. Bloom cut willow hoops while Tobin held the plank against the sagging ceiling, his arms shaking with the strain. The ceiling fought them, groaning, settling, sifting loose granules that fell into their eyes and mouths. Twice Tobin felt the plank slip in his hands, and twice he caught it before the weight could come down. At midnight, Blum's knife sliced into his palm. He did not cry out. He simply stopped, looked at the blood welling between his fingers, and wrapped the wound with a strip torn from his coat lining. "Keep working," he said. "We are almost through." "You are hurt." "I have been hurt before." He tied off the wrapping with his teeth and picked up the knife with his other hand. "The widow cannot wait." They tied the last hoop at 1 in the morning. The ceiling rose, not to its original height, but enough to crawl through. Tobin squeezed into the gap, feeling the weight pressing down on his back, feeling the snow wanting to let go, feeling everything he had built teetering on the edge of collapse. He made it through. On the other side, the passage was clear. He crawled the remaining 20 feet to Mrs. Rourke's cabin, opened the shutter, and found her sitting by a stove that had burned down to embers. "The fire is almost out," she said. Her voice was calm. "I was waiting for you." "I am here now." He climbed through the window, knelt by the stove, and began feeding kindling into the dying flames. "The tunnel is open again. Bloom and I fixed it. I will bring more wood." "Mr. Bloom." Her blind eyes turned toward the window as if she could see the passage beyond. "He hurt himself, did he not? I heard him make a sound. He cut his hand. Will he be all right?" Tobin thought about the blood on the snow, the strip of coat lining wrapped tight around the wound, the way Bloom had kept working with his off hand while the injury bled. "I do not know," he said. "I hope so." The crisis was not over. On January 25th, the temperature dropped to 51 below zero. Tobin had never felt cold like this, cold that stopped his breath in his chest, cold that turned his eyelashes to ice the moment he stepped outside, cold that seemed to have weight and mass and intention. The horses in the stable huddled together, steaming. The fire in Brackett's cabin burned all night, and still the windows frosted on the inside. Tobin made 2 trips through the tunnel that day. The first, at dawn, to bring Mrs. Rourke wood for the morning. The second, at dusk, to bring her soup and check the damaged sections. On the second trip, he found 3 new bulges in the ceiling. The weight was shifting. The entire drift above the tunnel was rearranging itself, pressing down on some sections and lifting off others, and Tobin could not brace fast enough to keep ahead of it. He fixed one bulge, and another appeared. He shored up a weak point, and a stronger point buckled. He was losing. On January 27th, Bloom collapsed in the stable. Tobin found him lying on the hay-strewn floor, his face gray, his breathing shallow. The cut on his palm had gone bad, red streaks running up his forearm, heat radiating from the wound, the beginning of something that Tobin did not know how to stop. Infection, Bloom whispered. I have seen it before. If the doctor cannot help, I will get the doctor. The doctor is in Silverton. Bloom's eyes closed. You cannot reach Silverton. The pass is buried. The road is gone. Tobin stood over the man who had taught him to read snow, to brace ceilings, to keep standing when the weight wanted to push him down. He thought about the tunnel stretching through the dark. He thought about Mrs. Rourke waiting by her window. He thought about the cold pressing in from every direction, looking for openings, looking for weakness, looking for anyone who stood alone. I will find another way, he said. The doctor was not in Silverton. The doctor was in camp. His name was Harmon, the same old man whose willow branches Tobin had stolen weeks ago. He was 70 years old, nearly retired, and he had trained as a field surgeon in the war before coming west to forget what he had learned. His hands shook when he worked. His eyes were not what they had been, but he knew infection, and he knew what to do. Mara Kells brought him to the stable. Tobin did not know how she found him, or how she convinced him to come, or what she promised in exchange. He only knew that Harmon knelt beside Bloom, examined the wound, and sucked air through his teeth in a way that meant nothing good. I can lance it, Harmon said. Clean out the poison. But the cold works against us. His body cannot fight if his blood runs thick. He needs warmth, rest, and time, none of which this mountain is willing to provide. The tunnel, Tobin said. Harmon looked at him. What? The tunnel? It stays warm inside, warmer than the surface, warmer than the stable. If I can get him through, you want to drag a sick man through a snow tunnel? I want to put him somewhere the cold cannot reach. Tobin's voice was desperate. Mrs. Rourke's cabin. The stove stays lit. The walls are sheltered. If we can get him there. Harmon looked at Bloom, then at Tobin, then at the tunnel entrance visible through the stable's back door. You're either brilliant or insane, he said. Possibly both. Both, Tobin said. That is what Mara keeps telling me. They moved Bloom through the tunnel on a makeshift stretcher, 2 boards lashed together padded with hay, narrow enough to fit the passage. It took 4 hours. Tobin pulled from the front while Mara pushed from behind, and every few yards they had to stop while Harmon checked the patient's breathing and made sure the wound was not reopening. At section 28, where the ceiling still sagged despite the new bracing, they had to lift Bloom over their heads and slide him through like cargo through a ship's hatch. His eyes opened once during the transfer, and he looked at Tobin with an expression that might have been confusion, or gratitude, or something else entirely. Where? He started. Somewhere safe, Tobin said. Rest. Bloom's eyes closed again. They emerged into Mrs. Rourke's cabin at midnight. She was waiting by the window, her hands clasped, her blind eyes wet. Is he alive? She asked. Yes. Tobin climbed through the window and turned to help Mara lift the stretcher. He needs warmth. He needs rest. Can he stay here? Of course he can stay here. She reached out, found the stretcher with her fingers, and guided it toward her bed. Put him there. I will sit by the stove. It is the least I can do for the man who helped you dig the road. They laid Bloom on the bed and covered him with every blanket Mrs. Rourke owned. Harmon dressed the wound again, cleaner this time, and left instructions for changing the bandages. Then he crawled back through the tunnel, shaking his head the whole way. Tobin stayed. For 3 days, he did not leave Mrs. Rourke's cabin. He fed her stove. He changed Bloom's bandages. He brought water from the snowpack outside her window, melted it on the iron top, and spooned it into Bloom's mouth when the fever broke and the old man was strong enough to swallow. He slept in the corner, wrapped in his coat, and dreamed of collapsing ceilings and rising drifts. On the 3rd day, Bloom opened his eyes and looked at Tobin clearly for the first time. You carried me, he said. His voice was weak but steady. Through the tunnel. Mara helped, and the doctor. But you carried me. Bloom's hand found Tobin's wrist and gripped it with surprising strength. The structure held. Even with all that weight, even with me on the stretcher, it held. It almost did not. Section 28 is still sagging. I need to brace it again when the storm passes. Then brace it. Bloom's eyes were bright. You know how. You do not need me watching anymore. He released Tobin's wrist and let his head fall back against the pillow. A structure keeps standing because somebody remembers where it wants to fail. You remember. That is what matters. Tobin sat in the dim cabin, listening to the storm rage above, and felt something settle in his chest. He remembered. And outside, above the buried cabin, the snow kept falling. On February 2nd, the storm ended. Tobin emerged from the tunnel to find sunlight. Actual sunlight, the first he had seen in 3 weeks, breaking through the clouds and turning the drifts into a blinding field of white. The cold was still vicious, the air still thin and sharp, but the wind had stopped. The snow had stopped. The siege, for now, was over. Men appeared on the buried lanes, digging pathways, checking roofs, counting losses. 3 cabins had collapsed under the weight. 2 men had died, 1 from cold, 1 from a falling beam. 7 horses had frozen in their stalls. The town of Animus Forks had survived the longest burial anyone could remember, but it had not survived unchanged. Tobin walked the upper lane with Mara beside him. She had brought coffee from the boarding house, real coffee, hot and bitter and strong, and they passed the cup between them as they surveyed the damage. Brackett is asking about you, Mara said. He wants to know where his stable boy disappeared for 3 days. What did you tell him? I told him his stable boy was keeping a blind woman and a sick tinsmith alive in a cabin he could not reach. She handed him the cup. He did not believe me. He wanted to see the tunnel. Tobin stopped walking. And? I showed him. Mara's voice held something that might have been satisfaction. I took him to the shed, opened the board, and let him crawl through. He went all the way to Mrs. Rourke's window. She was there, alive, arguing with Mr. Blum about whether he was strong enough to sit up. Brackett came back out looking like a man who had just watched a dead woman argue about soup. Tobin took a sip of the coffee. It burned his tongue, and he did not care. What did he say? Nothing, Mara shrugged. He walked away and has not spoken of it since. But he stopped docking your wages. And he unlocked the good shovel. Mrs. Rourke lived. Yehuda Bloom lived. The tunnel held. When the spring thaw finally came, and the drifts began their long retreat down the mountainside, Tobin walked the upper lane one last time and looked at the shrinking walls of white that had once buried everything. The tunnel was gone now, collapsed into itself as the snow softened, its arched roof and willow bracing, slowly surrendering to the warmth. By May, there would be no trace of it, just mud and meltwater and the ordinary ground beneath. But the people he had saved were still there, still alive, still telling anyone who would listen about the boy who had dug a road under the storm. Tobin stood in the sunlight, feeling the warmth on his face for the first time in months, and let himself believe just for a moment that he had done something that mattered. Then he walked back to the stable, picked up a shovel, and got back to work. The validation came in stages. First, the neighbors, then the miners, then the men who had laughed at the mole boy and predicted he would reach China before he reached the widow's stove. They came to the tunnel, mouth behind Brackett's shed, one by one, and in small groups, asking to see what the stable boy had built. Tobin showed them. He crawled through the passage with lanterns and explanations, pointing out the arched roof, the willow hoops, the vent holes that kept the air fresh. He let them feel the stillness inside, the absence of wind, the strange warmth that came from being buried beneath 10 feet of snow. Most of them said nothing when they emerged. They brushed the frost from their coats, nodded once, and walked away. But something had shifted in the way they looked at him. He was no longer the boy who swept muck and hauled feed. He was the boy who had dug a road under the storm. Mara Kells came to him 3 days after the storm ended, with a question and a proposition. "My sister's husband has a claim on the North Ridge," she said. 3 men working it, plus his wife and 2 children. The path to their bunkhouse drifts shut every time the wind picks up. They spend half their daylight digging it out again. A tunnel would hold better. That is what I told them. Mara folded her arms. They want to know if you would teach them. Not dig it yourself, they have the hands for that, but show them how. The curved roof, the bracing, the vents. Tobin thought about Bloom's lessons, delivered in the cramped darkness of the tunnel while snow pressed down from above. He thought about the knots that locked under pressure, the way to read density changes in packed drift, the places where structures wanted to fail. "I can teach them," he said, "but I need willow and wire, and someone to help me show them the first few feet." "I will get you willow." Mara's expression did not change, but something in her voice softened. "And I will help you dig. I have been watching you for weeks. I think I understand the shape of it." The teaching began the next morning. Tobin and Mara walked to the North Ridge claim with a bundle of willow branches and a coil of iron wire scavenged from Bloom's supplies. The men were waiting, 2 brothers from Missouri and their foreman, a quiet Welshman named Gareth, who had spent 20 years in coal mines before coming west. "Start from the lee side," Tobin said, pointing to a sheltered corner where the bunkhouse wall met the drift. "The wind packs the snow harder here. Harder snow holds better." "How deep do we dig?" one of the brothers asked. "Siul until you hit soft pack. Then stop. The soft layers are dangerous. They shift under load. You want to cut through dense snow and leave a shell of dense snow above you." He showed them the shape of the roof, curved like the inside of an egg, smooth and continuous, no flat sections that could sag and collapse. He showed them how to brace with willow hoops, spacing them closer together in weak sections and farther apart where the pack was solid. He showed them the knot that Bloom had taught him, the one that locked tighter under pressure instead of slipping loose. Gareth watched every movement with the intensity of a man who had seen cave-ins before. "The vents," he said. "You punch them straight up?" "Angled," Tobin demonstrated with a sapling rod. "Straight up lets water in when the surface melts. Angled keeps the hole dry and the air moving." "How far apart?" "Every 8 to 10 feet in stable snow. Closer if the air starts to taste stale." Gareth nodded slowly. "In the coal mines, we called that black damp. Bad air. Killed more men than cave-ins ever did. It kills here, too." Tobin met the older man's eyes. "If your lantern starts to gutter and there is no wind, get out. Do not wait. Do not finish what you are doing. Get out and punch a vent before you go back in." The brothers dug their first section that afternoon. Tobin watched from the entrance, correcting their angle when they cut too flat, stopping them when they moved too fast through a density change. By evening, they had carved 12 feet of passage, rough, uneven, but stable. "It holds," one of the brothers said, wonder in his voice. "I pushed on the roof and it did not move." "It will hold better once you brace it." Tobin handed him a willow hoop. "Tie it like I showed you, then do the same every 3 feet until you reach the bunkhouse." He left them working and walked back to camp with Mara beside him. The sun was setting, painting the snowfields orange and gold, and the cold was already deepening toward another killing night. "You are good at this," Mara said. "At what?" "Teaching." She glanced at him sideways. "You do not lecture. You show, and then you wait for them to understand. That is harder than it looks." Tobin thought about Bloom crouching beside him in the tunnel, pressing his palm against a wind crust, explaining without explaining. A structure keeps standing because somebody remembers where it wants to fail. "I had a good teacher," he said. The word spread. Over the following weeks, 3 more households asked Tobin to help them plan passages through the drift. A widow on the lower lane wanted a link to her chicken coop, where the birds were slowly freezing because she could not keep the path open. A bachelor miner wanted a tunnel to his privy because the walk was killing him in the cold. A family with 3 young children wanted an emergency crawlway from their cabin to their nearest neighbors, in case a roof collapsed and they needed to evacuate without stepping into the open air. Tobin helped them all. He did not charge for his time. He had no idea what to charge, and besides, the work felt like debt repayment rather than labor. These people had watched him struggle all winter. A few had helped in small ways. Most had simply not stood in his way. That was worth something. But the work took time, and Brackett noticed. "You're running a business on my hours," Brackett said. He had cornered Tobin in the stable, standing between the boy and the door, his thick arms folded across his chest. The accusation was not entirely wrong. Tobin had been slipping away during daylight to teach digging techniques, and his stable work had suffered. "I am helping people survive," Tobin said. "You are helping them dig holes." Brackett's voice was flat. "Holes that they should be paying someone to dig. Holes that are making my stable boy into something other than a stable boy. I am not charging them anything. That is the problem." Brackett stepped closer. "You think I do not see what is happening? The whole camp is talking about you. The boy who saved the blind woman. The boy who dug a road under the snow. Every time someone says your name, they are not saying mine." His eyes narrowed. "You work for me. Your reputation is my reputation. And right now, your reputation is making me look like the man who almost let an old woman die." Tobin said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not make the situation worse. "I want rent," Brackett said. "For the loft. For the shed you used as your tunnel entrance. For the wood you stole and the wire you took and the hours you spent digging instead of working." He held up a hand, fingers spread. $5. You pay me $5 by the end of the month, or you find somewhere else to sleep. $5. Nearly half of everything Tobin had saved, half of his only safety margin against the next disaster. "I do not have $5 to spare," he said. "Then earn it." Brackett smiled, and the smile was not friendly. "Or learn to sleep in the snow. Your choice." That night, Tobin sat in the loft and counted his coins. $11.32. He had earned a little over the winter, despite Brackett's docking, because Mara had started paying him for small repairs, and a few of the families he had helped had pressed coins into his hand, despite his refusals. $5 to Brackett would leave him with $6 and change. Not enough to survive another emergency. Not enough to buy passage down valley if he needed to run. Not enough to do anything except keep working and hope that nothing else went wrong. He thought about refusing. He thought about finding another place to sleep, maybe with Mrs. Rourke, or in Bloom's rented room, or in one of the abandoned claim shacks on the upper ridge. He thought about telling Brackett to go to hell. But Brackett owned the stable. Brackett owned the shed that served as the tunnel entrance. If Tobin made an enemy of him, the man could close off the passage that kept Mrs. Rourke alive, not with violence, but with locks and rights, and the simple power of ownership. He could not afford to fight. Not yet. Not until he had something that Brackett could not take away. Blum was sitting up when Tobin visited him the next morning. The tinsmith's color had returned, and his eyes were clear, though his bandaged hand still rested in a sling across his chest. Mrs. Rourke had fed him soup and bread and scolded him for trying to get out of bed too soon. The small cabin felt warmer than it had any right to feel, crowded with 3 people and the heat of a well-fed stove. "You look troubled," Blum said. "Brackett wants $5. Tobin sat on the floor near the stove, his back against the wall. "Rent," he calls it, "for the loft and the shed and everything I used to build the tunnel. He cannot charge you for what you already built. He can charge me for whatever he wants. He owns the stable. He owns the shed. If I do not pay, he can lock me out. And if he locks me out, the tunnel closes." Bloom's expression darkened. "And Mrs. Rourke goes back to being alone." Yes. Bloom was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. Mrs. Rourke's blind hands moved over a piece of mending she could not see, her fingers finding the stitches by touch alone. "There is another way," Bloom said finally. "You do not need Brackett's shed. You only need a starting point on the lee side of a building with a clear path to the widow's cabin. Every building on this lane is owned by someone. Not every building. Bloom leaned forward, his good hand gripping the edge of the bed. The old assay office, burned out 2 years ago. The lot is camp property. No one owns it. No one claims it. It is 30 yards from Mrs. Rourke's back wall, on the same lee angle as Brackett's shed. Tobin's mind raced. The old assay office. He knew the spot, a collapsed frame with half a roof. Useless for shelter, but maybe, possibly, useful as a tunnel entrance. If he could dig a new passage from there to Mrs. Rourke's cabin, he would not need Brackett's shed at all. It would take weeks, he said. I would have to start over. All the bracing, all the vents. Not all of it. Bloom's eyes were bright. You dig a connecting tunnel. From the old assay office to the existing passage. You tap into what you have already built and create a second entrance. Then Brackett can lock his shed all he wants. You come in through the other door. Tobin stared at him. You have been thinking about this. I have been lying in bed for a week with nothing to do but think. Bloom smiled, and the smile held something that looked like pride. You saved my life. I am not going to let a man like Brackett take away what you built. They started digging the new passage the next day. Tobin could not do it alone. His body was still recovering from the weeks of crisis, and Bloom's injured hand meant he could advise but not dig. But Mara came. And Gareth, the Welshman from the North Ridge, came with one of the Missouri brothers. And 3 other men whom Tobin had taught to dig tunnels came, bringing their own shovels and their own willow and their own quiet determination to help the boy who had helped them. They worked in shifts, 2 men digging at a time while the others rested and braced. The new passage started from the collapsed assay office, angling down through the drift toward the existing tunnel's weakest section, section 14, where Tobin knew the connection would be easiest to make. You have help now, Bloom observed, watching from the assay office doorway. That is new. They came on their own. Tobin was measuring distances, marking the angle of approach with a stick driven into the snow. I did not ask. You did not have to ask. That is the point. Bloom shifted his sling, wincing slightly. A man who gives knowledge freely does not need to ask for help. The help comes to him. On the 4th day of digging, they broke through. Tobin was at the working face when his spade punched into open air. Cold, still tunnel air, the air of the passage he had built weeks ago. He widened the opening, crawled through, and found himself in section 14 of the original tunnel, surrounded by the willow hoops and vent holes he had carved alone. 2 entrances now. 2 ways to reach Mrs. Rourke. 2 doors that no single man could lock. He crawled back to the new passage and found Mara waiting at the entrance with a bottle of something that smelled like celebration. It worked, she said. It worked. Tobin took the bottle and drank. The liquid was warm and sharp and tasted like survival. Brackett can keep his shed. We do not need it anymore. Brackett found out 3 days later. Tobin was crossing the camp when Brackett intercepted him, his face red with cold and something else, fury, maybe, or the particular frustration of a man who had lost a leverage he thought was permanent. You dug another tunnel, Brackett said, from the burned-out office. Yes. Without asking me, without paying me, without needing your permission. Tobin kept his voice steady. The assay lot is camp property. Anyone can use it. And the tunnel I built from your shed is still there. You can lock it if you want. I do not need it anymore. Brackett's hands tightened into fists. You think you are clever. You think you have outmaneuvered me. I think I have given myself options. Tobin met the older man's eyes. You wanted $5. I did not have $5 to spare, so I found another way. That is not cleverness. That is survival. For a long moment, Brackett said nothing. His jaw worked, chewing on words he did not say. Then he stepped back, and something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly, but recalculating. The widow, he said, She's still alive. Yes? And the tinsmith. He is recovering. Brackett looked toward the upper lane, where the roof lines still poked above the shrinking drifts. My horses almost died in that storm. One of them would have if Gareth and his men had not dug a path to the feed shed on the worst night. Tobin waited. They used your method. Brackett's voice was flat. The curved roof, the bracing. They told me it held better than anything they had tried before. It holds because the snow carries its own weight. The curve distributes the pressure. The bracing stops the weak points from failing. They told me that too. Brackett was quiet for a moment. Then he turned and walked away without another word. Bloom left Animus Forks on the first clear day of March. His hand had healed enough to travel, though the fingers no longer moved with the precision they once had. The infection had taken something from him: flexibility, strength, the ability to work metal for hours without cramping. He could still do the basic repairs, he said, but the fine work was behind him. There's a cousin in Denver, he told Tobin, a merchant. He says I can help with the books, keep the inventory, make myself useful without needing steady hands. He looked at his bandaged palm. It is not the life I imagined, but it is a life. They stood at the edge of camp where the trail to Silverton was finally passable again. Tobin had carried Bloom's bag to this point, a small courtesy, a way of extending the goodbye. You will be fine without me, Bloom said. Better than fine. You see things that other people miss. You understand how structures fail and how they hold. That is not a skill I taught you. That is something you already had. I only showed you how to use it. You showed me more than that. Tobin's throat was tight. You showed me that someone could help without wanting anything in return. Bloom smiled. I wanted something. I wanted to see if you could do it. And you did. He reached into his coat with his good hand and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Here, I cannot use it anymore. My hand does not have the grip. Tobin unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a tinsmith's awl, a short, sharp tool with a handle worn smooth by years of use. The blade was still bright. For punching holes, Bloom said. For testing ice. For 100 things I cannot teach you because you will have to learn them yourself. He gripped Tobin's shoulder with surprising strength. A structure keeps standing because somebody remembers where it wants to fail. You remember. That is what I am leaving behind. Tobin watched him walk down the trail until he disappeared around the first bend. The awl was warm in his hand, Bloom's body heat, transferred through the cloth, lingering for a moment before the mountain cold took it away. He stood there for a long time, holding the tool, watching the empty trail. Then he turned and walked back to camp. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Tobin returned to his work, stable chores for Brackett, tunnel maintenance, teaching sessions with the families who still wanted to learn. But something was different now. The mentor was gone. The voice that had guided him through the worst nights was traveling toward Denver, carried by a body that could no longer do the work it had been built for. He thought about what Bloom had said. You will be fine without me. Better than fine. He did not feel fine. He felt like a tunnel with half its bracing removed, still standing, but uncertain of the weight that might come next. The weight came on April 3rd. A late storm rolled in from the northwest, not the grinding siege of January, but a sudden violent assault that dropped 4 feet of wet snow in 18 hours. The drifts that had been shrinking for weeks climbed again, burying paths that had been clear the day before, and pressing down on roofs that had already survived too much. At noon, a child came running to the stable. The Kellerman cabin, the boy gasped. On the east slope. The roof came down. There are people inside. Tobin dropped his shovel and ran. The Kellerman family had 3 children, ages 4 to 9, and their cabin was the farthest from camp on the east slope, nearly half a mile from the nearest neighbor. The roof collapse had happened at mid-morning, when the weight of wet snow finally exceeded what the aging timbers could bear. The front half of the structure had pancaked, trapping the mother and 2 of the children under a mess of beams, and drifted white. By the time Tobin arrived, A dozen men had gathered at the site. They were digging frantically, throwing shovelfuls of snow aside, trying to reach the buried section before the cold finished what the collapse had started. "We cannot find them," one of the men said. His face was gray with exhaustion. "The snow is mixed with the debris. Every time we dig, more slides in from the sides." Tobin looked at the collapsed cabin. The rear half was still standing, damaged, leaning, but intact. The front half was a chaotic pile of broken wood and compacted drift. "Stop digging," he said. The men stared at him. "Stop digging from above. You're making it worse." He pushed through the group to the edge of the collapse. "The weight is pressing down. Every shovelful you remove lets the pile settle further. You're compacting them." "Then what do we do?" Tobin thought about Bloom's voice in the darkness. "A structure keeps standing because somebody remembers where it wants to fail." The Kellerman cabin was not standing. It had already failed, but the failure had created its own structure, a new arrangement of weight and space that might, if he read it correctly, have left pockets where people could breathe. "We go under," he said. He explained it quickly, because there was no time for anything else. They would dig a tunnel from the stable section of the cabin, the part that was still standing, horizontally into the collapse zone, not down through the debris, but sideways beneath it. The rubble would form the roof. The packed snow beneath would form the floor. If they braced carefully and moved slowly, they could create a passage to wherever the trapped family had ended up. "That is insane," one of the men said. "That is what I do." Tobin was already moving toward the stable section. "Are you coming or not?" They dug for 3 hours. Tobin led, cutting into the compacted drift beneath the rubble while other men braced behind him. The passage was tighter than anything he had built before, barely 2 feet wide, the ceiling so low that he had to move on his belly. Broken beams jutted into the space at random angles. Shattered glass crunched under his hands. The air smelled like pine sap and blood. At the 10-foot mark, he heard something. A voice. Thin, high, terrified. "Mama! Mama! Someone is digging!" Tobin pushed forward faster. The voice guided him, a child's voice, coming from somewhere ahead and to the left. He angled toward it, carving a path through debris that shifted and groaned with every movement. At 14 feet, his hand broke through into open space. A pocket, maybe 3 feet across, maybe 4. The collapsed roof had formed a tent above it, the beams catching against each other and holding just enough weight to create a cavity beneath. Inside the cavity, a woman was curled around 2 children, her body forming a shield between them and the debris above. Her face was pale, her lips were blue, but her eyes opened when Tobin's lantern light fell across her face. "Help," she whispered. "Please help." Getting them out took another 2 hours. Tobin widened the passage while the men behind him shored up each new section with whatever they could find, broken boards, pieces of furniture, anything that would hold weight. The woman could not walk. Her legs were pinned under a beam that had stopped just short of crushing them. They had to lift the beam, slide her free, and drag her backward through the tunnel while she screamed with pain she could not contain. The children came easier. They were small enough to crawl, small enough to follow the guide cord that Tobin had strung along the tunnel wall. They emerged into daylight one by one, blinking and crying and alive. When the last child was out, Tobin sat in the snow and let his body shake. Ephraim Cutter found him there. The older man had arrived sometime during the rescue, bringing rope and shovels and the grim authority of someone who had seen disasters before. He had not interfered. He had not tried to take charge. He had simply watched the boy who had once been told to say goodbye to a dying woman now pull a family from the wreckage of their own home. "You knew what to do," Cutter said. "I guessed." Tobin's voice was hollow. "The structure fails, but the failure creates new structures. Pockets, spaces, places where the weight distributes itself and leaves room for people to survive. That's not a guess. That is understanding." Cutter crouched beside him. "I have been digging people out of collapses for 15 years. I have never thought to go under instead of through." I learned it from someone. Tobin thought about Bloom's hands pressing against a wind crust, reading the density changes by touch. He's gone now, but he taught me to feel where things want to fail. The rest I figured out. Cutter was quiet for a long moment. The sound of celebration drifted from the Kellerman site. Shouts of relief, children crying, the noise of a family that had almost died and had not. I told you once that the old woman would die, Cutter said. That the cold would take her first and hunger would finish what the cold left. I was wrong about that, and I suspect I have been wrong about a lot of other things too. He stood, brushed snow from his knees, and looked down at Tobin with an expression that held something like respect. If you ever want to learn how the old-timers do things, he said, come find me. I have 15 winters of knowledge that might be useful to someone who knows how to listen. He walked away, leaving Tobin alone in the snow. The rescue changed everything. Within a week, Tobin was no longer the boy who had saved the blind woman. He was the boy who had saved the Kellerman family. The story spread through camp and down to Silverton and across the mountain passes to wherever stories traveled in the high San Juans. People he had never met stopped him on the lane to shake his hand. People he had helped before came back with new questions, new problems, new requests for the knowledge he carried. He tried to help them all. He taught tunnel digging to miners and widows and families with too many children and not enough shelter. He showed them the curved roof, the willow bracing, the vents that kept the air fresh. He explained how to read snow, the density changes, the wind crusts, the places where collapse was waiting to happen. But the more he taught, the more he realized how much he did not know. Bloom's lessons had given him a foundation. The crisis had given him experience. But there was a lifetime of knowledge still out there, held by men like Cutter who had survived winters that should have killed them. On the first day of May, when the passes had finally opened and the last snow was retreating to the highest ridges, Tobin found Cutter at the edge of camp and asked for the lessons he had been offered. I want to learn, he said. Everything you know about surviving these mountains. I want to learn all of it. Cutter studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, like a man who had been waiting for the question. Come with me tomorrow, he said. I will show you where the real dangers are, the ones you have not seen yet. The summer that followed was an education. Cutter taught him to read the mountains, not just the snow, but the rock and the water and the wind. He showed him where avalanches were likely to run and where they were unlikely to stop. He showed him the signs of unstable slopes, the way trees grew crooked where the soil was moving, the subtle shifts in color that indicated underground water waiting to freeze and heave. He showed him how to build shelters that would last for years, not just months, root cellars and cold stores, and protected passages that could survive the worst the San Juans could throw at them. Tobin absorbed it all. He asked questions until Cutter told him to stop asking and start doing. He made mistakes and corrected them. He built things that failed and learned why they failed and built them again. By autumn, he was no longer just a stable boy who could dig tunnels. He was becoming something else, a specialist, a consultant, a person that others came to when they needed to know how to survive. Mrs. Rourke watched his transformation with blind eyes and a knowing smile. You are growing, she said one evening, as Tobin sat by her stove and described his lessons with Cutter. I can hear it in your voice. The hesitation is gone. You speak like someone who knows what he is talking about. I am learning to know. That is more than most people manage. Her hands found his face, tracing the familiar landscape of cheekbones and jaw. You saved my life, you know. Not just that first winter, but all the winters since. I would have died in this cabin if not for you. You would have found a way. No. Her voice was gentle but firm. I would not have. I am blind and old and stubborn, but I am not foolish. I know what would have happened to me if you had not dug that road under the snow. Her fingers lingered on his cheek. You gave me time. That is the most precious thing anyone can give. Time to live. Time to know that someone cared whether I lived or died. Tobin did not know what to say. He sat in the warm cabin, listening to the fire crackle, and felt the weight of what she was telling him settle into his chest. Time. He had given her time. And in return, she had given him purpose. Bloom's letter arrived in late October, carried up from Silverton by a mail rider who looked half frozen and entirely fed up with mountain work. The letter was short. Bloom's handwriting had always been efficient, but it carried news that made Tobin sit down on the stable floor and read the words twice to make sure he understood them. My hand has not recovered, as I hoped. The fine work is beyond me now, and even the simple repairs tire me faster than they should. The doctor says the infection did more damage than we knew at the time. My cousin has been kind, but I am not made for sitting behind a counter and counting another man's inventory. I am not writing to ask for help. I am writing to tell you that the all I gave you was not a gift. It was an inheritance. You have already become what I hoped you would become, a builder, a teacher, someone who understands structures and their failures. The lessons I gave you are yours now. Use them. Pass them forward. That is all I wanted. The letter closed with a blessing in Hebrew and a signature that trembled at the edges. Tobin folded the paper and tucked it inside his shirt, against his skin, next to the leather pouch where he kept his coins. The first anniversary of the Great Burial passed without fanfare. January came with cold but no siege, ordinary mountain weather, bitter but survivable. The tunnels Tobin had built and taught others to build held firm. The passages that connected cabin to woodshed to stable stayed open. The camp of Animas Forks weathered its second winter since the storm with fewer deaths, fewer collapses, fewer of the quiet catastrophes that had once been accepted as the price of living at 11,000 feet. Tobin noticed the difference. So did everyone else. 3 families used your method this year, Mara told him one evening, counting on her fingers. 4, if you include the Gareth claim, and 2 of the mining operations dug covered passages to their shaft houses. They say it cuts their clearing time in half. They built them themselves? You taught them well enough that they did not need you hovering. She smiled. That is the point, is it not? To make yourself unnecessary. Tobin thought about Bloom's letter. An inheritance, not a gift. Use them. Pass them forward. I suppose it is, he said. But he was not unnecessary. Not yet. Because the next disaster came in February, when a late storm swept through with the casual violence of all mountain weather, and a family on the far side of camp found themselves trapped in a situation that no one else knew how to solve. The message came at dawn. 2 children and a grandmother, isolated in a cabin that had lost its stove to a chimney collapse. No fire, no heat, temperatures dropping to 30 below. The grandmother too frail to travel through open air. The children too young to dig themselves out. Someone had to reach them. Someone who knew how to move through buried snow without dying. Someone who understood that the drift could be a road instead of a wall. Tobin gathered his tools, the all Bloom had given him, the willow hoops he always kept prepared, the lamp and matches and cord, and started walking toward the far side of camp. Behind him, the sun was rising over mountains that did not care whether anyone lived or died. In front of him, a family was waiting. He had work to do. The grandmother's name was Eliza Hardwick, and she had survived 3 husbands, 2 territories, and a wagon journey that had killed half her company before she reached Colorado. She was 74 years old, blind in one eye from a childhood fever, and too proud to admit that her body had finally betrayed her. Tobin found her sitting in a cabin without heat, wrapped in every blanket she owned, holding 2 grandchildren against her chest to share what warmth she had left. The stove fell, she said when Tobin crawled through the window he had cut open from his emergency tunnel. The chimney gave way in the night. I heard it go, and then there was nothing but cold. I am here now. Tobin was already assessing the damage. The chimney collapse had shattered the stove's pipe connection, leaving a gap where heat escaped into the frozen air instead of warming the room. The stove itself was intact. The problem was getting it working again before the cold took the children. I cannot fix the chimney, he said, but I can seal the gap and redirect the smoke. He worked for 2 hours by lantern light. He packed snow around the broken pipe to create a temporary seal, counterintuitive, but the snow would hold until he could find better materials. He cut a new vent hole through the back wall, angling it so smoke could escape without letting wind in. He lit a small fire in the stove and watched as the heat began to climb. By noon, the cabin was warm enough that the children had stopped shivering. "You saved us," Eliza said. Her one good eye fixed on him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "A boy I have never met crawled through the snow and saved my grandchildren. I am not a boy anymore." Tobin realized it was true as he said it. He was 16 now, still young by camp standards, but old enough to have done things that mattered. "And I did not save you. I just kept you alive long enough for help to arrive." "That is the same thing." Eliza reached out and gripped his wrist with surprising strength. "What is your name?" "Tobin Mercer." "I will remember that name." Her grip tightened. "I will make sure everyone I know remembers that name." She kept her promise. By spring, the story of the Hardwick rescue had spread through the San Juan mining camps like fire through dry timber. People who had never heard of Animus Fork suddenly knew about the boy who dug tunnels under snow, who saved blind women and trapped families, who understood something about survival that most men spent lifetimes learning and still never grasped. Requests for help came from farther away. A mining company in Silverton wanted advice on covered passages for their winter operations. A rancher near Ouray wanted to know if buried corridors could work for moving cattle feed during storms. A doctor in Durango had heard about Tobin's methods and wanted to learn whether they could be applied to emergency evacuations in mountain communities. Tobin helped them all, traveling when the weather allowed, corresponding by letter when it did not. He earned money for the first time, not much, but enough to stop worrying about whether he could afford to survive. He bought better tools, better clothes, a coat that actually kept out the cold. He rented a small cabin of his own near the upper lane where Mrs. Rourke still lived. He was becoming something he had never expected to become, a person with a trade, a reputation, a place in the world. Brackett watched the transformation with an expression that shifted from anger to confusion to something that might have been grudging respect. The hostile skeptic had never apologized for the rent demands, the locked shovels, the attempts to undermine Tobin's work. He was not a man built for apologies, but he was a man built for calculation, and by the second summer after the Great Burial, he had calculated that fighting Tobin Mercer was no longer in his interest. The shift came quietly, in small gestures rather than grand declarations. Brackett stopped charging Tobin for loft space. He stopped complaining when Tobin borrowed tools. He started greeting him by name instead of ignoring him entirely. And then, on a cold morning in late November, Brackett came to Tobin with a request. "My feed shed," he said. His voice was flat, stripped of the hostility that had once been its defining characteristic. "The path drifts shut every storm. I lose hours digging it out, hours I cannot spare." Tobin waited. "I want a tunnel." Brackett's jaw tightened, as if the words cost him something. "From the stable to the feed storage, the way you build them, curved roof, braces, the whole system." "You want me to build it for you?" "I want you to show me how." Brackett met his eyes, and Tobin saw something there that he had never seen before. Not humility exactly, but something close to it. "I have watched you teach half the camp. I have watched men who mocked you ask for your help. I am not too proud to learn from someone who knows things I do not." Tobin thought about the nights he had spent in Brackett's loft, shivering under thin blankets, wondering if the morning would bring another demand for money he did not have. He thought about the locked shovels and the docked wages, and the threats that had hung over him all through that first terrible winter. He could refuse. He had every right to refuse. But Blum's voice whispered in his memory. A structure keeps standing because somebody remembers where it wants to fail. "Tomorrow morning," Tobin said, "bring your own shovel. I'll show you where to start." They built the tunnel together, Tobin and Brackett working side by side in the buried space behind the stable. The older man was clumsy at first, cutting too flat, bracing at wrong angles, making the same mistakes that Tobin had made in those first desperate nights. But he learned. He listened. He asked questions without defensiveness, accepted corrections without argument, and slowly, painfully, became competent at something he had once dismissed as a waste of time. On the third day of digging, when the passage had reached 20 feet and the roof was holding steady, Brackett sat back on his heels and looked at the curved walls around him. "I owe you an apology," he said. Tobin stopped working. "What?" "That first winter, I tried to stop you. I wanted you to fail because your success made me look like a fool." Brackett's voice was quiet, almost thoughtful. "I was not wrong about much, but I was wrong about that." "You were trying to protect your position." "I was trying to protect my pride." Brackett shook his head. "Not the same thing. Pride made me blind. Pride made me watch a boy dig through the snow to save a woman I had written off as dead, and still insist that he was wasting his time." He looked at Tobin directly. "I cannot take back what I did, but I can learn from it, if you are willing to keep teaching." Tobin thought about Mrs. Rourke, sitting in her warm cabin while the storm raged overhead. He thought about Bloom's bandaged hand, the inheritance of knowledge passed forward despite injury and loss. He thought about all the people who had doubted him and all the people who had helped him, and how the line between those two groups was not always as clear as he had once believed. "Keep digging," he said. "You're getting better." Mara Kells had been watching from the beginning. She had watched Tobin grow from a desperate boy stealing willow branches to a young man with a trade and a reputation. She had helped him dig tunnels, carry wood, haul sick men through buried passages on makeshift stretchers. She had brought him broth when he was too exhausted to feed himself, and she had told him the truth when he needed to hear it, even when the truth was hard. Now, as the second winter after the burial settled into the mountains, she found herself working beside him more often than she worked anywhere else. "You are not just helping anymore," Tobin observed one afternoon, as they prepared willow hoops for a new passage. "You are learning." "I have been learning since the first time I watched you dig." Mara's hands moved quickly, bending and tying with a skill that had come from months of practice. "You taught half the camp. Did you think I was not paying attention?" "I thought you had your own work." "I do, but my work does not have to stay separate from yours." She looked at him with the direct gaze that had always made him slightly uncomfortable. "The boarding house is good work, honest work, but it is not what I want to do for the rest of my life." "What do you want to do?" "This." She gestured at the willow, the tools, the tunnel entrance visible through the shed door. "Building things that keep people alive, teaching others to do the same, working with someone who sees the same things I see." Tobin was quiet for a moment. The words hung in the air between them, not quite a proposal, but something close to it. "I cannot promise anything," he said finally. "The work is hard. The money is uncertain. The winters will always be trying to kill us." "I know." Mara smiled, and the smile transformed her face into something warmer than he had ever seen. "That is why I want a partner who understands the work, not someone who watches from the side and waits for spring." They were married the following June, when the passes were clear, and a minister could travel up from Silverton to perform the ceremony. It was a small wedding. Mrs. Rourke, Ephraim Cutter, Gareth, and the Missouri brothers, a handful of families Tobin had helped over the past 2 years. Brackett did not attend, but he sent a gift, a set of iron tools professionally made, with handles that fit Tobin's grip perfectly. The note that accompanied them said only, "For the work." Mara wore a dress she had made herself from fabric traded at the general store. Tobin wore a coat that did not leak wind. They stood before the minister in the same high valley where Tobin had once arrived, with nothing but coins in his pocket and grief in his chest, and they promised to build a life together in a place that seemed determined to kill them both. "You understand what you are committing to," the minister said. It was not a question. "We understand," Tobin said. "The mountain does not care, but we do." The years that followed compressed into seasons. Winter work and summer preparations, tunnels dug and tunnels taught, children born, a daughter first, then a son, both of them learning to read snow before they learned to read books. The cabin on the upper lane expanding, one room at a time, as Tobin's reputation grew and his savings accumulated. Mrs. Rourke lived another 7 years. She died in her sleep on a December night, her stove burning steady, her cabin warm, her blind hands folded on her chest. Tobin found her in the morning when he came to bring her wood, and he sat beside her body for an hour before he could make himself leave. She had asked for a simple burial, and he gave her one. But he also carved a marker from mountain stone, and on it he wrote the only epitaph that seemed to fit. The boy did not let her die alone. Bloom's letters stopped coming in the winter of 1891. Tobin learned later that the tinsmith had died of pneumonia in a Denver boarding house, his cousin's inventory finally balanced, his hands finally still. There was no funeral that Tobin could attend, no grave he could visit, but he kept Bloom's all in his toolkit for the rest of his life, and he taught every student he ever trained to use the phrase that Bloom had given him. A structure keeps standing because somebody remembers where it wants to fail. By the turn of the century, Tobin Mercer was no longer young. His hair had gone gray. His hands, once quick and sure, had developed the stiffness that came from decades of cold weather work. His daughter had married a surveyor and moved to Denver. His son had taken over most of the teaching, traveling to camps and ranches where the old methods were still needed. But every year, when the first deep snow fell, Tobin walked the upper lane and listened. He listened for the sound of buried stovepipes. He listened for the muffled voices of people who had been sealed in by the drift. He listened for anyone who might be trapped, alone, waiting for someone to dig a road under the snow. Most years, he heard nothing. The camp had learned. The methods had spread. The knowledge that had once been his alone now belonged to dozens of families, hundreds of miners, anyone who had watched and listened and understood. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes, he heard a tapping from beneath the white, a hand against wood, a voice calling for help. And when he did, he picked up his shovel and started digging, because that was what he had always done, and that was what he would do until the mountain finally took him too. Mara found him one morning in March of 1904, sitting on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the sunrise paint the peaks in colors that had never grown old. "You're thinking about her again," she said, settling beside him with 2 cups of coffee that steamed in the cold air. "About all of them." Tobin took the cup she offered. "The widow, Bloom, the Kellerman children, everyone we pulled out of the snow over the years. That's a lot of people to think about. It is a lot of people who are still alive." He sipped the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. "Sometimes I try to count them, the ones we saved directly plus the ones who learned our methods and saved others. The numbers get too large. I lose track." "Does it matter?" Mara leaned against his shoulder. "The exact number?" "No." He watched the sun climb higher, the light transforming the snowfields from gray to gold. "What matters is that they are alive. What matters is that the knowledge kept spreading. What matters is that somewhere, right now, someone is digging a tunnel through a drift because they learned from someone who learned from us." He did not say the rest, that his body was failing, that his hands could no longer hold a shovel for more than an hour, that the winters were becoming harder to survive. She knew. She had always known. But she also knew what he had built, what they had built together. And that was enough. Tobin Vale Mercer died in January of 1907, during a storm that would have killed him 40 years earlier if he had not known how to survive it. His son found him in the tunnel he had dug to the old assay office, the second entrance, the one that had freed him from Brackett's control all those years ago. He had gone in to check the bracing after a heavy snowfall, and he had never come out. They buried him next to Mrs. Rourke, on the upper lane where he had first learned what it meant to keep someone alive. The camp remembered. For years after his death, people told stories about the boy who had dug a road under the snow. They told the stories to their children, and their children told the stories to theirs, and the knowledge he had carried spread through the mountains like seeds scattered by the wind. In Animus Forks, 37 families learned the methods he had taught. They passed those methods forward, and the methods kept spreading to Silverton, to Ouray, to camps and ranches across the San Juans. By the time the great mining boom ended and the high camps emptied, the knowledge had traveled far beyond anything Tobin could have imagined. One specific detail survived longest: the tunnel to Mrs. Rourke's cabin, the first one he had ever built. People talked about it for decades, how a 14-year-old boy with a bent grain scoop had carved a passage through 10 feet of drift, how he had kept a blind woman alive when everyone else had written her off as dead. The tunnel itself was gone by the second spring, collapsed into meltwater and mud. But the story remained. The method remained. The stubborn insistence that the drift could become a road instead of a grave, that remained too. Tobin Mercer lived out his life in the San Juan Mountains, never leaving the high country that had almost killed him and had instead made him into something worth becoming. He was 54 years old when he died. He had spent 40 winters in the snow. He asked to be buried with Bloom's awl in his hand, and his family honored the request. The tool that had been an inheritance was now an heirloom, passed from tinsmith to stable boy to the grave, where both of them finally rested. The epitaph his son chose was simple. He remembered where it wanted to fail. In January of 1884, a storm dropped 25 feet of snow on Animus Forks and sealed every cabin under a burial of white. Ephraim Cutter, who had spent 15 winters in those mountains and buried 2 teamsters in slides, looked at the drifted upper lane and delivered his verdict. If that old woman stays snowbound another week, the cold will take her first, and hunger will finish what the cold leaves. He was wrong. When the townsmen finally cut through to Mrs. Elspeth Rourke's cabin that spring, they did not find a frozen corpse or an empty room. They found a swept hearth, a well-fed stove, and a narrow tunnel ribbed with willow leading back through the drift to a woodshed on the lower lane. They found a blind woman, 68 years old, sitting upright and arguing about soup with a Jewish tinsmith who had nearly died himself that winter. And they found Tobin Vale Mercer, 14 years old, undersized, quick with his hands, standing at the tunnel entrance with a bent grain scoop over his shoulder and the look of someone who had done exactly what everyone said could not be done. The storm had buried her door. The boy had turned the burial into a road. Light fell through the opened drift onto walls of packed snow that had held for months against weight that should have crushed them. The widow placed one hand against the tunnel wall and let her blind fingers trace the curve of the arch, the shape of an egg, the shape of survival, the shape of something built by someone who refused to let the mountain win. She did not speak. She did not need to. The road had held.